In this lesson, we're going to fully define a complex sketch. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to apply sketch dimensions, apply sketch constraints, and identify graphic changes to fully define sketch entities. In Fusion 360, we're going to work with the supplied dataset attachment bracket. Once you have this file uploaded and open, let's go ahead and take a look. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to expand our sketches folder. I want to make note of a few different things here. First, after sketches are used or consumed by features, for example, extrudes, the sketch will automatically become hidden. We can turn them back on or make them visible at any point in time that we need to use them. Also note that each sketch has small icons next to it. 3 of them have a red lock icon. This is telling us that these sketches are fully defined. However, sketch 1 has a small pencil icon. This is telling me that this sketch is underdefined. So I'm going to select sketch 1, right-click, and edit the sketch. From here, some of the sketch elements are black. Black sketch elements tell me that these are fully defined. However, many of them are still a light blue color, which tells me that they're underdefined. There are other colors for sketch elements, such as orange. These are representing a dashed construction line. There'll also be colors for things like projections. We're not going to be talking about those just yet, so let's focus on constraints and dimensions to fully define the sketch. Whenever we're trying to identify what element needs to be defined, we can start by grabbing on certain entities and moving them back and forth. So you'll note that even though there's a horizontal dimension for the whole location, it's referencing this corner. The end of this line is at the origin. However, the length can change based on this larger arc. The more we move these points around, the more we can see that that sketch element seems to be changing the most, while all the rest seem to stay fixed. So I'm going to use this to my advantage, and I'm going to identify this one as the sketch element that still needs a definition. To get started, we can think about a few different ways in which we can fully define this sketch. We can apply a dimension to it, or we can apply a constraint. From here, let's start by applying a dimension. So from our Create dropdown, we're going to select the Sketch Dimension tool. If you've modified your toolbar layout, you can find this by navigating to the bottom of the Create menu or using D on the keyboard. We're going to select this arc and drag a dimension off and to the left. Right now, it's measuring 55.45 millimeters. I'm going to manually enter a value of 50. So by typing 50 on the keyboard when the dialog box is highlighted in blue, will allow me to manually enter that dimension. Once we hit enter, we can see that the dimension is now taken. I'm going to hit Escape on the keyboard to get off of my Sketch Dimension tool. All of our other sketch elements have now turned black, which means they're fully defined. However, I want to explore another way in which we can define this. I'm going to right-click on this dimension, and notice that we have an option called Toggle Diameter and Toggle Driven. Because this value is referencing an arc, it defaults to a radius value, but we could toggle that to a diameter value if we wish. The option to toggle driven here, we'll go ahead and select that, and make note that now the dimension is displayed differently. Also note that our sketch elements have gone back to being underdefined. We can move them back and forth, and the sketch is now modifying itself as we move it around. So notice that this radius value is changing. And that's because we toggled it to be a driven dimension. Driven dimension means that we're simply placing it there as a reference to identify its size, but we're not using this value to control the geometry. We're going to take a look at applying another type of reference. In this case, we're going to make a concentric constraint. We're going to select concentric. I'm going to pick the small arc and the large arc. When I pick those two, I'm going to hit Escape to get off my constraint tool, and notice that now this dimension is 40 millimeters, and all of the rest of the sketch elements have turned black, which means that they're now fully defined. This is another way in which we can define our sketch element. A concentric constraint will tell that these two arcs need to have the same center point. This allows us to keep a consistent wall thickness for this design, whereas simply applying a dimension would not give us that same level of control. We could use other options, such as referencing other dimensions, a thickness dimension for example, and then using that to offset the radius value. In this case, a radius value of 20 plus the thickness of 20 will give us a radius value of 40 on the outside. So there are many other ways in which we can relate the geometry in our sketch, but in this case, taking a look at constraints and dimensions, giving us a fully constrained and fully defined sketch is going to be a great way for us to explore this process. Once we select Finish Sketch, notice that now we have errors in the timeline. Because we made adjustments to the shape, we now need to go back and fix a few things. First, let's rotate the model around and inspect it. One thing I notice is that the extrude here no longer cuts all the way through this geometry. When I select a face that belongs to that feature, inside of our timeline it gets highlighted. So let's go ahead and modify this feature by right-clicking and editing the feature. We can see that the extrude starts at this face and goes down, and there are a few different ways we can fix this. We can change the starting point to be a manual offset, or we can change it to be in two directions. This can either be symmetric, going the same distance in both directions, or we can set it to two sides and manually control it. In our case, the symmetric option with Through All allows us to go completely through the geometry in both directions, and then we can say OK. With that feature updated, you can see that now we have to make a few more adjustments. While most other geometry has updated properly, we still have a problem with this chamfer. And it's possible that the chamfer edge here overlapping is causing the problem. So let's go ahead and edit this feature. If we want to add more edges to the selection, we need to hold down the Control key. Let's go ahead and select the Control key and add the upper and lower edges. Notice that this is giving us an error. Let's go ahead and deselect those and try one more time. Because of the proximity, it's causing problems because these chamfers are overlapping. Depending on the design intent, we can do something such as modifying the chamfer width, in this case down to 0.5 millimeter, or modifying some of the other geometry. In our instance, I'm going to modify the chamfer width to be 0.5 millimeter and say OK. Now the design is updated properly, I can go back to a home view and I can make a save to my file before moving on to the next lesson.